All right, the next ethical principle we'll discuss is informed consent, and this comes from the Babby reading. And the basic idea here is before someone agrees to be part of a study, you as a researcher should inform him or her of all the conceivable risks or benefits associated with being part of that study. Therefore, the research subject knows what's likely to occur, what sort of benefits could come from the study, what its associated risks are. They know that information, and then they can knowingly choose whether to be part of this study or not. They're making an informed decision because you are outlining the risks and benefits of a study. So if nothing else, if someone agrees to be part of your study, they are committing a certain amount of your time. So at minimum, your obligation to a participant is to say, I want you to fill out this survey. It will take you 5 minutes, or it'll likely take you 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever it happens to be. Or if you're looking to interview someone, you say, I anticipate this is going to take about an hour. Or if you really want really informed and really in-depth knowledge about someone, like if you're doing something like an oral history, you say, I want to interview you for multiple hours over the course of a certain amount of weeks or months. Just so, if nothing else, the researcher or the subject knows how much time, right, they're committing to being part of the study, and they can weigh that in and whether they want to be part of the study or not. Maybe if a survey is 5 minutes, someone's willing to do it. If the survey takes an hour to complete, maybe they don't want to do it, and so they're going to opt out. But you're outlining the risks and benefits, and based on that, the participant can make an informed, knowledgeable decision regarding their decision to participate or not. Now, in some cases, the risks of being part of a study could be larger than just simply the fact that you have to give up a certain amount of time. And especially if there are really obvious conceivable risks associated with the study, you need to be very upfront and honest about that. So the fact that, we'll talk about this more in a little bit, there are no shield laws that protect sociologists, which means the police can haul you in and ask you who you've been talking to and what they've said. That is a really important risk, that if you are dealing with populations that you have reason to suspect are engaging in illegal activity, that is a risk you want to be very upfront about, because that could really have negative consequences for your research subject. And they may say, well, there's no way I'm going to talk to you then, because I don't want to take that risk of the police hauling the researcher in and disclosing the fact that I am part of like a car theft network or whatever the case happens to be. At the same time, too, there could be benefits of a study. The general benefit is that you're contributing, to kind of like the generation of knowledge. So it's a very altruistic act. This is for the good of humanity because we're going to know more being part of your study. But sometimes there's financial rewards. You get a $5 or $10 gift certificate, if you are part of a study, or you're entered into a raffle and you might win like a flat screen TV or whatever it happens to be. Regardless, the main thing is before someone willingly agrees to be part of your study, you need to outline these risks and these benefits. And even if at least in theory, even if being part of a study is risky, as long as the participant knows all the risks associated with this research, then you as a researcher have upheld your ethical obligation of informed consent. They've made an informed choice. They're choosing to be part of your study. Therefore, it is ethical. So, at least in principle, right, JT should realize that having Venkatesh studying him is risky. There are certain risks associated with Venkatesh following JT around. Assuming that JT knows all those risks, and Venkatesh has told him all those risks, and he still wants to be part of the study, then ethically, Venkatesh is in the clear. This is similar to how in medical research, right? Say taking an experimental drug, right? There could be potential benefits associated with it. Maybe it would treat a specific condition you have, but there also could be conceivable risks, right? Say a certain percent of people who take this kind of drug have these kinds of side effects. Even if someone take an experimental drug, even if that experience is really risky, as long as they know those risks and they're willing to accept them, then in terms of informed consent, your research is ethical. Now, the part of the Babby reading where this comes up is a little bit buried, and so some people might have missed it because it's in this separate box at the top of page 470, and it bleeds over to 471. But this is where McKinney, who is cited in Babby, outlines what informed consent is. So if you're looking for a definition, this is where you would find it. All right, the next principle we'll talk about is voluntary participation. And this comes both from Babby and the American Sociological Association, ASA, and I'll give you information on that. But the main idea, as Babby points out, is that no one should be forced to be part of a study. They need to opt in. That being said, right, the general rule is you can't force anyone to be part of your study, right? They need to willingly opt in, usually on the basis of informed consent. But there are some times and places where this rule doesn't apply, and so it's really important to understand where voluntary participation is a requirement and where it is not. So voluntary participation, this requirement that people need to opt in, is not applicable to public places or places where there's no expectations of privacy. So the mall, back when we had malls and before malls were dying, if you wanted to observe people in the mall or like in specific stores within the mall, that's completely fine because that's a place where it's a public space and there's no expectation of privacy. You want to see how people interact at movie theaters, that's fine. Again, because that's a space where there's no expectation of privacy. At Gettysburg, right, if I wanted to observe people as they watch across campus, I can do that because, again, that's a fairly public space. There's no expectation of privacy there. But if I wanted to study people, how they interact in their dorm rooms, your dorm room is a private space. There is an expectation of privacy there. And so if I wanted to study students, right, and how they interact in their dorms, students would definitely need to opt in, and I could never force them to be part of it, that kind of study. Same thing on the internet. Some things on the internet are very public, right, and publicly disclosed, and those are fair game. You can study those if you want. Some things, however, are private, and if they're private, then you would need to get people to opt in to be part of a study. So if you're looking at Facebook pages and someone has their Facebook page set up so that there are no filters whatsoever, right, or no privacy concerns, anyone can see everything that someone posts on their Facebook page, that's fair game. You can use that in your study. If there was a private internet group that you wanted to study, since it is a private group, you would need to ask permission in order to get access to that group. People would need to opt in into that kind of study. And so this is ASA's statement on this issue. It comes up in the context of informed consent, but it really applies to voluntary participation. And to be fair, the line between informed consent and voluntary participation is a little bit blurry. But for our purposes, it just refers to voluntary participation. So you don't need to get informed consent or ask people to be part of a study. If it's carried out in public places where privacy is not expected, this may be publicly available information about individuals, naturalistic observations in public places, analysis of public records, and archival research. So you could study genealogy research. That's fair game because that's public knowledge. You could study, say, housing deeds because those are public records and the such. So if it's public, generally you don't need informed consent. If there is a space where there's an expectation of privacy, you need to get people to opt in. All right, and another wrinkle to this idea of voluntary participation is that participants need to be told that they can leave the study at any time for any reason. So not only do they need to agree to be part of a study, but they also need to be told, so they must opt in. You also need to tell them that they can opt out at any time for any reason. And this was the problem with the Milgram study from an ethical point of view. All right, the question itself was a good one. Will people kind of blindly follow authority? That's a really important question to have answered. Where it became ethically problematic, though, was that when people thought that they were shocking other people to death, and they did want to leave, and they were trying to leave, and the researcher said, no, you need to stay, right? They weren't being given that opportunity to leave, and that raises this ethical question of whether that study violates voluntary participation. All right, the next issues that come up are anonymity and confidentiality. And the main thing to remember here is they're not the same thing. They're not synonymous with one another. And you need to be really careful about which term you're using when you're talking about examples from Gang Leader for a Day. Confidentiality are situations where you as a researcher know who said what, right? So you know who was part of your study, you know the answers that they gave or the information that they disclosed, but you promise not to give that information up, right? So the researcher knows what's going on, but they promise to keep it a secret. Anonymity are cases where the researcher doesn't know who said what, or maybe even who was part of a study. So very different things. And if you're ever dealing with a very risky population, studying things in an anonymous manner gives your research subjects more protection because you couldn't be hauled in by the police or other authority figures and say, tell us who said what, because you don't know, or you legitimately don't know. So, for example, if I wanted to study drug use on Gettysburg College campus, I should be very concerned about people's privacy and try to protect their well-being here. So if I'm worried about that, I'd want to try to give out an anonymous survey. So that way, even if the powers that be, if President Bob calls me in and tells me, I need to disclose who are the people that are, say, dealing drugs on campus, I would have no idea, right? Even if I know there were certain people who were dealing, I wouldn't know who they were because my research was conducted in an anonymous manner. If it's just confidential, though, then I know who said what. And if people told me they were drug dealers, I would know that. But then it's my obligation not to disclose that information and not say person A is the person who is dealing drugs. I just need to keep that a secret. Now, given the nature of Venkatesh's research, he's doing ethnography. He's dealing almost exclusively with issues of confidentiality. The vast majority of his research could not be anonymous. So anonymity is really not an issue in terms of Gang Leader for a Day. Really, the matter is confidentiality. The general idea is your research either kind of by default, either needs to be anonymous or confidential, unless the participant agrees to disclose his or her identity. And sometimes people do want to disclose that they're part of a study, but the default is it's going to at least be confidential, if not confidential, anonymous. And the only way you can get around that is if a person affirmatively says, it's okay to disclose, I was part of your study, and here is what I said. Now, there are some exceptions to these requirements and these obligations. So one is you don't need to uphold the principles of anonymity or confidentiality for things that occur in public locations or locations where there's no expectation of privacy. So if things happen in public, right, that can be treated as public knowledge, and you can attach someone's name to their actions. Now, you may choose not to, right? You may decide to grant confidentiality in this case, even though you don't have to. But you don't, as long as something happens in a public forum, you don't have to grant confidentiality. The theory being that other people would know who did what in a particular situation, and so they could figure that out on their own. And therefore, and because someone is doing this in a public setting, they are at least implicitly okay with their behaviors being transmitted to others who could observe them. Life and health threatening situations are not protected by this. And here your legal obligations would trump your research ethics ones. So Venkatesh found this out the hard way, right? That if he was learning about a specific drive-by shooting, he had a legal obligation to inform, right, the authorities that these specific people were trying to or do a drive-by shooting against this other group. So he was legally required to break confidentiality in those kinds of situations. Now, if he's talking about it in general, that was fine. In general, this is how we would do it. But if he learned of specific, incredible information that someone was going to get harmed, then his legal obligation to disclose that information to the authorities trumps this ethical principle. All right, I mentioned this before, but there are no shield laws for sociologists and the way there are for journalists and their sources, where in most places, journalists are protected. And so even though they know who said what to them, they can't be hauled into the police and be forced to disclose that information. The same is true for your doctors. Doctors cannot be, you can disclose information to doctors, and they can't be forced to give up that information. And that's also true, at least in some places, but I think across the board, for religious leaders, like priests and stuff like that. You can disclose information to that person, and that person cannot be compelled to disclose what you said. But for our purposes, for sociologists, there's no shield law, which means you can be compelled to testify or to disclose this information to authorities, figures, or you go to jail for contempt of court. That can be your choice. And this is not just a theoretical issue. Sociologists have faced this issue in real life. So there is a sociologist named Rick Scarce, I believe is how you, or maybe it's Scarce is how you pronounce his last name. And as part of his, I believe his dissertation research, he was studying people who are part of the Earth Liberation Movement. And these are people who were very hardcore environmentalists. And they would do things like they would break bulldozers to prevent bulldozers from, say, carrying out logging operations. So these are people who are willing to sabotage equipment. In some cases, I think they burn buildings and stuff like that, all from their point of view to protect the environment. So Scarce interviews folks who are part of this movement. The powers that be catch wind of this. I think it's probably the FBI. They call Scarce in. They say, tell us who you've talked to and what they've said. Scarce says no. And they said, okay, you're in contempt of court. Now you go to jail. And he ended up sitting in jail for 5 months and ended up writing a book about his experience. But he was in there for 5 months. He said, I'm not going to give up my sources. And he never did. And eventually, the judge freed him just because the judge realized that we can keep him in jail but that's not going to change. He's just not ever going to disclose this information. So the charges was dropped and he was freed. So again, the fact that there is no shield law can be important in certain circumstances, and it can force you in this situation where it's either do you break confidentiality, do you go back on your promise if you made that to your research subjects, or do you face jail?